What's going on, guys? Welcome to We Got a Problem. So it seems YouTubers are not the only people calling out the BBC's biased reporting regarding President Donald Trump's state visit this week. The BBC viewers have been calling them out for their biased coverage also. Now, I would say that this is significant since I'm sure at least some of the people that have contacted the BBC would be considered their key demographic. Now, there are complaints from viewers about the BBC essentially promoting and trying to legitimise the ridiculous balloon stunt in the eyes of their viewers by having one of them in their studio on the Victoria Derbyshire programme. Comments and actions by certain BBC reporters or guests have also been called out in this programme, along with the general bias against Trump across the whole week's coverage, which we all know for a fact is true. The BBC has been a propaganda tool this week for the anti-Trump outrage mobs, peddling lies that I have dismantled time and time again. Now, you would think, oh great, the viewers are calling them out, maybe they will apologise for it now. Well, you would be very wrong. These people lack the basic dignity most people learn before the age of 5. I have edited this short programme to put the questions next to the answers, which are being given by news editor James Stevenson. The original show format has the host asking all of the questions consecutively before going to the news editor to ask his responses to the viewers' claims about biased reporting and disgraceful actions. Now, they start off the programme showing a member of the public complaining about the stupid Trump baby balloon she had in the studio.
So to the BBC's coverage of the visit, starting just an hour after Air Force One landed on Monday morning with this spectacle in the Victoria Derbyshire show studio.
Protests, as you know, are planned across the UK while he's here. Tomorrow, an even bigger version of this giant inflatable mocking the US president is due to fly over London.
But the presence of that inflatable offended a number of viewers, including David Parry.
I was very disappointed when I tuned into the Victoria Derbyshire programme to see that on Monday she had a blimp of the President of the United States, Donald Trump, in the studio. I felt this was totally out of character and didn't bode well for the BBC's reputation for being unbiased.
Well, with me now to discuss this is news editor James Stevenson. A lot of issues raised. Let's go through some of the specific complaints then. The mini blimp in the Victoria Derbyshire studio, was that disrespectful?
No, I don't think it was disrespectful. It was an item, for those of your viewers who saw the item, about the protests. We knew protests were going to be a feature of the visit. The item featured someone who was organising the protests and had brought that mini blimp with them, and someone who was a supporter of Donald Trump in the studio. So it was an item about that, and that was part of the production of that item.
Well, I'm sorry, but you are wrong. Just because someone who is going to protest happens to be in the studio does not mean it's okay to inflate a ridiculous balloon designed to mock a guest of the country, because the radical few who bothered to turn up and protest want to bring it with them. Because let's face it, the numbers that attended these protests was an embarrassment to the outrage mobs, as we will see a bit later on. He says, we knew protests were going to be a feature of this visit. Well, they would not have been a feature of the visit if you and the rest of the deranged media and communist parties didn't keep banging on about it, trying to get people to go to them. You should have been reporting on the news properly instead of blowing up ridiculous balloons that are an embarrassment to our nation. You are a taxpayer-funded broadcasting corporation costing the public $3.5 billion a year. You're not CNN. This guy don't want your opinion. He wanted unbiased reporting on the news about the president's visit. Now, the viewer complaint is shrugged off by this clown, essentially calling his complaint invalid, claiming the mini blimp was part of the item, meaning part of the show. Well, it brought nothing to the table except to prove the BBC's bias against a democratically elected president of another country. It's obvious you work for the biased broadcasting corporation. It's nice to know you make no effort to hide it.
In advance of the visit, some politicians had made clear that they did not consider President Trump welcome to the UK, with the London Mayor Sadiq Khan lambasting the president in a newspaper article the day before his arrival. Mr. Trump responded by calling Mr. Khan a stone-cold loser. But in reporting this war of words, some thought the BBC focused only on the insults flying in one direction. Sue Jones thought this was typical of BBC manipulation of news coverage. It was not Donald Trump that caused consternation with his tweet before landing at Stansted, but what Sadiq Khan wrote, which Mr. Trump responded to. Get your facts right and present the true story. The war of words with London Mayor Sadiq Khan caused some concern that the BBC's coverage of this focused on Mr Trump's response, the stone-cold loser phrase, not on the original article the mayor wrote, which the president appeared to be reacting to.
Well, I think it was a pretty striking phrase, and the timing was pretty remarkable, so that as we were all preparing to cover the landing of Air Force One into Stansted, up came this tweet. We're familiar with President Trump tweeting, but perhaps not with tweeting at that kind of moment before touchdown on a state visit. So I think inevitably it got a great deal of attention in the early hours of the coverage. But then we obviously progressed on to other aspects of the state visit as they developed.
Was there enough context, though, around that tweet?
Yeah, I think there was. As it developed, and certainly as we moved into the kind of packaged form of telling the story, we referenced the fact that Sadiq Khan had attacked President Trump himself, and we know there's been a long-running transatlantic spat between the two of them. So I think the initial news reporting was pretty dramatic, quite a dramatic intervention at that moment. I thought was fair, and then we developed the coverage as we went along.
So in this clip, they respond to the viewer who makes the factually correct claim that the BBC completely omitted the fact Sadiq Khan had called President Trump a fascist the day before in the Observer newspaper, when reporting on the Trump tweet just as he landed. But did you guys notice something they completely forgot to say in both reporting what the viewer claimed and the editor's response to it? I know I did. Once again, they did not mention that Sadiq Khan had called Donald Trump a fascist, along with his supporters, and included the Brexit Party and his supporters in that label during his smear attack article the day before Trump arrived. Go back and listen to the host and editor talk about how Sadiq Khan started it, prompting Trump to call Sadiq Khan a stone-cold loser, which they actually quote. It's funny how they don't quote Sadiq Khan calling millions of people a fascist, though, during either the host's explanation or the editor answering the accusation. Why are the BBC protecting this snivelling shitweasel we call the London Mayor? It seems to be a theme so far with this show that claims put against the BBC each week must not be taken seriously because they literally just ignored every single one of them that they're talking about. This one, the guy calls them out for omitting something, and they literally continue to omit it. That is unbelievable. Now, I can only imagine that the guy asking this question is thinking the same thing as, like I said, I just can't believe it. And yeah, they've just literally essentially ignored him. They don't care. They got no interest.
As the president was treated to a ceremonial welcome and private lunch at Buckingham Palace, the news channel interviewed the historian Simon Sharma, who made his views very clear.
Why are you so
I think he's a morally
about
degraded person. I think he's an enemy of the American Constitution. And he essentially believes in a bloated version of presidential authority.
Josie Addleton was one of those who objected to that interview, and she recorded this video to explain why.
If he was invited on to share his knowledge of such events, I hope the BBC will withhold his fee. But if he was invited on as the BBC knew he was so anti-Trump, they should be ashamed. We had to listen to Mr. Sharma launching into a very insulting diatribe against Mr. Trump, which was obviously his own personal view. The language and tone of the comments were dreadful. Why did the reporter allow him to continue, and where was the balance? Why was no one invited to give an opposite point of view? This is a state visit of the President of the United States, and I would expect the BBC to show a bit more respect.
We saw a clip there of historian Simon Sharma, who was kind of commentating during, the kind of gun salute. Viewers complained there were too many anti-Trump voices like him holding forth during the visit. Do they have a point?
I hear what your contributors are saying. I don't think that was true of the coverage overall. So, for example, we had the American ambassador to the US was on Andrew Marr's programme on the Sunday, so the day before the visit. Simon Sharma is a hugely distinguished historian, British historian, and knows about these events, and so he seems the right sort of guest to have on an occasion like that. I think we know that President Trump is a hugely controversial and divisive president, both in his own country and here. So I think there's going to be a bit more kind of colour to some of the commentary than you might have on a different occasion with a different president.
So we hear about the historian Simon Sharma using the BBC platform to voice his opinions on Trump, not his expertise on state visits. She calls out the bias of the reporter allowing him to just go on and on about how terrible Trump is. Now, this lady complaining would like his fee to be held from him if he was brought on to give his expertise, and if he has been brought on for his opinion on Trump, then that is disgraceful on the BBC's part, and I couldn't agree with her more. Nearly every panel or interview has been a majority anti-Trump, which in most cases included a biased host shouting over people when they talk about the facts the BBC didn't want to hear. It was exactly the same in the lead up to the EU elections. Smear campaigns, heavily Ramona-laden panels. The experts, of course, just brushes off her claims with a standard line he used throughout this show. What a waste of space. But I guess this is the sort of thing we have come to expect from the biased broadcasting corporation. Now, the next 4 complaints from viewers are going to be one after the other, as the host decided to get the editor to answer them all together, as I suppose they are relatively similar, and I think that maybe they were running out of time. Now let's check it out.
Those who felt the president deserved a more respectful treatment were also irked by the caption which appeared on screen on Monday's Politics Live: "The Donald has landed." Steve Davis emailed us with his response. "I do not remember seeing the Barack has landed when the previous president came, or the Xi has landed when the Chinese president visited, so why should the BBC disrespect the USA in such a way now? I seriously dislike his values, at least as reported, but the USA deserves respect from the BBC. This visit is because he is the president, not because he is Donald Trump." Monday ended with a discussion about the state visit on Newsnight, on which Emily Maitlis put this point to one of her guests.
You've got a president who can't even drive up the Mall to Buckingham Palace without protests, has to take helicopters everywhere because he's not liked at all here.
Peter Murphy went on Twitter to respond. "He's not liked at all here. How dare she? She doesn't speak for me and millions of others." On Tuesday, as the president met the Prime Minister and other politicians, crowds gathered in protest. Several comic versions of Donald Trump were on display, including the blimp anticipated by the Victoria Derbyshire show, and one spotted by reporter Lee Milner on the News at 1.
Overall, it has been a fairly peaceful protest. In fact, protesters have called this the Carnival of Resistance. And with costumes like this, they've taken the theme rather strongly.
David Fairbottom had this reaction. "I appreciate the anti-Trump demonstration had to be covered, but focusing on a disrespectful caricature of Donald Trump is hardly cutting-edge journalism. Worse still was your reporter laughing at the so-called joke. BBC bias strikes again." And James Mason had this to say about the BBC's coverage of the public reaction to President Trump this week and the reporting more generally.
When the cameras were covering the protests, I would say for me it came over at about 80% coverage against President Trump and about 20% for him. I just thought that could have been more balanced. Bearing in mind he was over for a special occasion for a state visit and also the D-Day ceremony. The news reporting I thought was really negative. It was all seemed to be that he was bad. Now, whether you like Trump or loathe him, I think the reporting should have been more even.
There were a number of these moments over the course of the state visit, like some of the insulting anti-Trump placards and caricatures at the protests that the BBC showed. Politics Live putting up a caption that said "The Donald has landed," which again some viewers feel just added up to a tone of disrespect. Do you think the BBC might have got it wrong with this state visit?
I don't think we did, and I think we had a huge amount of coverage on a range of all our platforms, TV and radio and online, of the visit, the many dimensions of it, the state visit with the Queen and the state banquet, the politics of the second day, the D-Day commemorations down in Portsmouth and Southsea. So I think that taken as a whole, I feel we did a very good job, and I think we've had a lot of reaction to suggest that's the case. I think the occasional moment of levity or a script line or two that members of the audience don't like, I hope they won't let that overshadow a general perception of what we thought was a good week of coverage.
I suppose what people are wondering is, did it all end up, the criticism being too personal about Trump rather than respect for the office of president?
Well, I think there is a little bit of a division in the public between those who think that they don't like President Trump and he shouldn't have been afforded the kind of honours that he was, and you saw that reflected with the attitude of some of the main opposition parties in the country, and those who feel that whatever, as your contributor said, whatever people think about President Trump, it's a state visit with a very close and important ally, and he ought to be treated with as a representative of America and leave aside more of the personality. So I think opinions differ about that. Your contributors have tended to be of the people who thought he should have been shown more, as it were, deference because of his position. There are many people who are very genuinely upset and offended by his views and some of the stances he's taken. So I think, you know, we're trying to report these things fairly and reflect the wide range of views.
So the first clip calls out the Politics Live show caption saying the Donald has landed. Not the most egregious thing, but still disrespectful, especially considering, as the viewer pointed out, the BBC have never done that before. When we hear from another viewer rightfully complaining about the Newsnight anchor saying President Donald Trump needs to take a helicopter everywhere because he is not liked here at all, which of course is complete rubbish. Their protest, as you see in the third clip, looked almost completely dead. And that was outside the Houses of Parliament, so the centre of the protest, and from what I could see, there must have been less than 200 people there, which brings us on to the third complaint, which is that the BBC reporter seen in the clip was laughing at the jokes made about the Trump signs during the protests. Now the last two are disgraceful behaviour because the Newsnight anchor should not be saying he is not liked at all. That is a baseless claim to make. A blatant smear attempt to make the public believe no one likes him to marginalise anyone who does. And as for the unprofessional reporter laughing live on air at Trump is a disgrace. If she wants to laugh when off air, that's down to her. But on air, she should be an impartial and professional journalist. Now, the last point rounds off everything, as it's a general observation that the coverage was 80% negative towards Trump. I would place it at closer to 95% negative coverage over the last week. Trump derangement syndrome has been in full effect within the BBC and mainstream political parties like the Lib Dems and Labour. And of course, it's the theme of this show as well. The editor once again deflects or ignores the complaints, so basically everyone who complained to the BBC about their shockingly biased coverage has been ignored by this slimy toad. So that's going to be the end of the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Did you catch the BBC's omission when they once again left out exact information the viewer had complained about? Or did you miss it? I can't believe they actually still admitted what that shitweasel said, calling Trump a fascist. It still baffles me that they've admitted that again. I can't believe it. Don't forget to leave a like, share the video and subscribe. And I will see you all in the next video.
Man's gonna kill this shit. You'll need SWAT and medics too. Off for the contract credits due. Punchline king, I'm ahead of you. A your knees where you're heading to. Whip is green but the lights are blue. Bars are shit, take the mic from you. Heating up cheese, I don't like fondue.